I have only told this story a couple of times because it makes me extremely uncomfortable to relive that fateful night in the Five Ponds wilderness. It brings back terrifying memories, but the story should be told. I have experienced other bizarre things out in this area of the ADK. I've heard whoops and tree knocks on numerous occasions, as well as heard something very large walking through the water on two legs around midnight or 1 a.m., and then shortly after, I saw two different sets of glowing red eyes in the woods that were at least 8 feet high apiece. The woods are a very different place out there in the Five Ponds wilderness. The woods absolutely are a different place out there in the Five Ponds wilderness. Was it a Sasquatch that stole his deer and raised hell at Tom's hunting camp that frightful October night? Maybe. We may never know. But whatever it was, it's out there, and if you're not careful, you may find yourself face to face with something you never wanted to experience. And for our final spooky story here in the October sessions, we'll head to the central Adirondack Park, over to Hamilton County. This story comes from the book The History of Hamilton County by Ted Aber and Stella King and was brought to my attention by a listener named Bill. The title of this chapter, Ghosts at Indian Lake. Ghosts came to live with the people at Indian Lake. The most widely known were those at Beaver Meadow, between North Creek and Indian Lake Village. Sometime around mid-century, when lumbering held sway in the area, Benjamin Butler lumbered at the foot of Peaked Mountain and had his camp at the headwaters of what has sometimes been called Butler Brook. Butler employed a rough gang of lumberjacks, mostly Canadians. One day a peddler drove his jolting wagon across the rough roads into the camp. His was an unusual, forbidding appearance. Large of build, enormous hands and feet with fingers crooked and bony, piercing red eyes stared from a face covered with coarse white whiskers that matched the shaggy white hair of his head. And never did he turn his gaze when possible to avoid it. He was in his early 70s. The lumberjacks suspected that this strange-appearing peddler was there for no good. The story is told that he was dragged from his bunk that night, murdered, and then together with his horse and cart was dumped into the old cellar, and the remains set afire to destroy all evidence of the misdeed. After some years, the old lumber camp was rebuilt into a house. Stillman Lamphere lived there in the late 1880s. His story of hearing someone entering the house at 10 o'clock at night and moving into the cellar was only one of the recounted incidents. Soon, definitive recurring circumstances formed into a pattern, known and sometimes seen by a number of the older residents. Some of those being Lester Wallace, Hezekiah Davis, Lottie Griffin, Mary Fagan, Henry Bennett, Dick Butch, and many others. There would at times come a persistent tapping against the window. The light step of someone walking upstairs would be heard at midnight. The wail of the weeping woman would be heard from the dark depths of the cellar, midway between the farm and the highway where the murdered peddler's body had lain. At times, the face of the hairy giant man would suddenly appear around the corner of the house, his long white locks trailing to the ground. And again, one could hear the clanking covered wagon of the bewhiskered ghost and see him riding behind the lean old horse. Willett Randall of North Creek came to the place in 1900 and remained there for 37 years as the caretaker of the estate owned by the Bear Manning Corporation. And he was soundly warned of this house by the older local residents. Not long after his stay, strange incidents began to occur. Yet all had natural explanations. A mysterious tapping at the ice house proved to be the limb of a tamarack blowing against the roof in the wind. The steps upstairs turned out to be those of an errant sheep that had escaped its pasture and wandered into the house while the caretaker was away. and the wail heard in the old cellar proved to be a quart bottle whose open end moaned in the wind. More surprising, perhaps, was the incident of the woman who came for a visit with her husband and sat alone on the porch. She had never been there before and knew nothing of the stories of this place. Suddenly, she emitted a terrified scream. Pale and speechless, came running toward her husband and Randall. At length, she was able to tell that the head and shoulders of the image of the devil had appeared around the corner of the house. His long white beard hung almost to the ground. His swollen eyes were blood red, almond-shaped, and blinking as his long, crooked fingers reached out to grab her. It was the promise of Stillman Lamphere that in the full moon in June, the rattling of the peddler's wagon would be heard coming up the road in early evening. Shortly after, the ghost would be seen arriving at the house. Randall had almost forgotten the warning, and on one such June evening, he sat on the porch watching the shadow of deer feeding nearby and listening to the crickets and the sound of a tree frog while watching the fireflies, while nighthawks and bats circled on high. Then, as told by Willett, suddenly the frog was still. The crickets were gone. A deer raised her head, ears thrown forward, then with a snort bounded away. The whip-poor wills froze to the rock. Silence brooded. Then, without further warning, I heard a rumbling sound coming over the hill beyond the meadow. The unmistakable sound of a running horse. I listened. It came closer. There was no mistake about it this time. I heard the grinding of the wheels of the old cart strike the stony bed of the roadway, then bound from side to side as the horse's hooves beat an audible tattoo and moved swiftly toward the house. Then I distinctly heard the crack of the whip, and I heard profanity just as Stillman had said. Then there came a scream from the throat of a bearded madman. On he came. I could make out the shadowy form, softened by the subdued light of a silvery moon. Instinctively I stood up. My first impulse was to run, but to where? I felt the cold beads upon my forehead, a sickening sensation. I tripped over a chair, and it sounded like a cannon. Then these words came distinctly. "Watch out. Here I come." And the ghost vanished into thin air. I pinched myself to make sure I was in the flesh, and I was. I never told this one to Stillman, and I never told it to anybody else for a long time. I didn't dare to. I am still an unbeliever in ghosts, but you answer that one. The lives of the mysterious pack peddlers of earliest days were worth little at Indian Lake, if legends were to be believed. Ghosts frequented older houses in the area, as the residents told. Always it was surmised that it was a pack peddler returning to the scene of his last grim association with life on Earth, before he was murdered. At Griffin Meadow, a family told of eating dinner one evening. Suddenly the sound was heard of a man ascending the ladder into the loft, and it was followed by what sounded like apples being dumped and rolling around on the attic floor. Again the harness was yanked from the horses while the agonized voice of an unknown man was heard to groan and groan. It was a returning pack peddler who had been brunt of foul play years before on the Griffin farm, as the stories told. The ghosts in the house near Cedar River were encountered by a number of inhabitants. The place was originally inhabited by Richard Jackson before he built his Arctic Hotel, later known as the Cedar River Hotel. Some locals said the ghost dated to his day and the story of a pack peddler was at times repeated. Darwin Parker later occupied the house for some time. Then declaring that it was haunted, he moved away, selling it to William Payne. Rillie Porter Payne, stepdaughter of William Payne, recalled, "It was all right in the daytime, but at night we would hear all kinds of noises throughout the house. We had no lights, but one lamp for the kitchen, for it was supposed to be very dangerous to carry one, and for everything else, we had tallow candles." One resident told of hearing a baby crying one night. Ignoring the sound for a while, she continued to read her Bible. She was later disturbed by the same crying sound. The noise was traced to a floorboard that had been loosely nailed with spikes. So they removed the floorboards to a grisly discovery: the bones of a baby found underneath. The bones of the baby were removed and given a proper burial. At another time, a dog was heard coming upstairs in the darkness of night at this same house. Suddenly, it jumped in the bed where the retired residents lay, and then when lights were struck, no dog was found, and no dog was even owned by the family. Around the year 1905, Mrs. Rue Ramsey lived there with her son-in-law Walter Ingalls and his young children. Mrs. Ramsey stated, "There's something not normal about this house." Noises would be heard in the basement and the fruit jars would be rattled. Once she called out, "Are you after me or old Dirk Jackson?" Then there was a tremendous crash of glass. And at other times, knocks would be heard at the headboard of the bed and just under the stove. Mrs. Ramsey was glad to leave the place once and for all. Spooky, spooky, spooky. It would appear that the ghosts at Indian Lake are alive and well over in the central Adirondack Park. Well, that's going to wrap up the October sessions here on the 46 of 46 podcast. I hope you enjoyed these spooky topics and tales from all around the ADK, the Bigfoot talks, the campfire stories. Next week, we'll be right back with our regular scheduled programming, back inside our beloved High Peaks for a summit session where you'll hear the inspiring story of two women completing the first ever female unsupported thru hike of the 46 High Peaks. That's next time on 46 of 46. If you had some spooky fun this month and you enjoy the show, I'd love it if you could leave a rating and review wherever you listen to this podcast. See you all next Friday. Remember to always leave no trace, do the rock walk, and if you carry it in, carry it out. And don't forget to look behind you when you're out on the trails. You never know what could be lurking in the woods. See you on the trails, everyone, and thanks again for listening to the October sessions here on the 46 of 46 podcast. Have a happy Halloween. Pure ADK is an online community and lifestyle brand that creates Adirondack-inspired apparel and goods. They're all about sharing their adventures and creating quality products that are a reflection of the outdoor lifestyle and activities we love in the Adirondack Mountains. Whether born and raised an Adirondack native or a frequent vacationer, we all have a common bond, those feelings and memories that the Adirondacks evoke in us. As a bonus for listeners of the podcast, they're providing a 15% off discount. When shopping in their online store, use the promo code 46podcast to redeem the offer. PureAdirondacks.com. Check it out. 46 Podcast. Pure ADK. Exploration unbound. Planning to do some backpacking soon? Great. So you'll need an ultralight, ultra convenient, and of course, delicious coffee option for your mornings on the trail. You'll want to pick up some new Campfire Blend Steeped Packs from Recess Coffee. Steepable coffee packs. Perfect for the trail. Easy to carry in, easy to carry out. Pick up a carton of 10 or individual packs for your next camping trip. For 10% off your order, use the promo code RECESS46. That's RECESS 46 at recesscoffee.com.